Hey everyone, thank you for listening to the Truth Be Told She Has a Name series. I want to know what you think, all your thoughts about the series. Let us know by taking a short, anonymous survey. You can do this by going to apmstudios.org/survey. That's apmstudios.org/survey. And I can't wait to hear from you. And as always, before we get started, listener discretion is advised. Okay, so me and my team decided to jump on Zoom recently to talk through all of the surprising information we've learned just over the last few weeks during the run of this podcast. We thought it'd be fitting to devote an entire episode to what we've discovered. So sit back as we delve into all things She Has a Name, our behind the scenes reporting, our efforts to talk with the person of interest authorities would like to connect with, and some of the inconsistencies in the initial reporting of Anita's disappearance back in '87. And later in the show, we're going to share some of the beautiful messages you have sent to both me and Antonio. Joining me for this episode is She Has a Name showrunner Nicole Hill, our research producer Kristen Fraser, and producer Marie Mendoza. We kicked off with Nicole and the team talking about the making of the show and the impact it's had on their lives.
It is amazing. It took us months and months to make the show, and for a long time it was just our little collective working on it and talking over all these themes and the stories and what it meant to us and what we hoped it meant to others. But then to put it out in the world and hear back the ways that it connected even beyond what we imagined it's blown my mind, reading all the comments, reading how personally people connect with the story.
Yes.
In particular, the Detroiters and the way that the Detroiters and recognize their city and themselves in the story. It's better than I could have imagined.
What about you, Marie?
Now that we have completed the series for the most part and we can sit back and look at the story as a whole, I think about the courage that it takes for a lot of folks to talk with us and really the gift that someone telling their story to you is. And I am so pleased that people have seemed to gain some sort of release and some sort of healing, like you said, from this process of excavating and telling their stories. So that's what I'm reflecting on.
I was talking to someone last night who sort of brought that up and said, oh, that sounds like really heavy thing to be working on for so long. And I'm like, it's actually been such an uplifting thing because we're dealing with the living and they are such survivors. I see myself in some of them. I see a connection, and it's been very fulfilling, not depressing. But in the end, those things have brought out something that's very peaceful and very fulfilling.
I love the way you put that we have been dealing with the living, survivors, people who have made it through. And that is the part that makes it uplifting and healing. It's just so right. I want to get to the latest on the investigation of the murder and disappearance of Anita. Detroit police are still investigating. They say that it is an open murder case, and right now they have no updates on this investigation. They've not named a suspect. It's extremely challenging to piece together a 37-year-old murder investigation, but there is a person of interest that they want to talk to, and his name, as you all learned in the podcast, is Leroy Lyons, and he's currently serving a life sentence for the murder of his niece and her boyfriend, which was actually, we learned through the making of this podcast the same month and year that Anita was murdered. Leroy is pretty well known in Detroit because his 7 children died in a house fire in the 90s on Mack Street, and Detroiters know it as the Mack Street Fire. He and his partner, Sharice Williams, she was the mother of 6 of the children, went to trial actually for the deaths of their children, but they were acquitted. And their defense was that Leroy had mistakenly, he might have done something or mistakenly set the house on fire when he was trying to thaw out the pipes in his home because they had no heat at the time. And this happened in February of that year. Now, as you learned from the podcast, Leroy and Anita, they were friends. And there are indications that they were lovers. They had known each other from when they were children. They grew up in the same neighborhood. We learned a little bit about their relationship through Anita's journal entries, which we went over in episode 8. Kristen, you actually reached out to Leroy in prison because we wanted to see if he would talk to us about his relationship with Anita and if he knew anything about her disappearance and her murder. Talk us through what happened when you reached out.
Well, a couple of things. We worked through a system called JPay. So that's how people communicate with people in the Michigan Correctional Facility. That's sort of how they encouraged us to make first contact as opposed to doing it through any media. And I started off by connecting through Leroy with the help of Ira Todd, who's been a great resource through all of this.
The former Detroit police detective, yep.
Who's talked to a lot of people. So we talked about the things that would make Leroy want to talk to us. So we started off with a letter that was from me, but from Ira, talking about life on the streets, talking about his experiences. Then when we went after for a very general purpose, right? We want to know about this time period. We want to know about what's going on. We think that you have a lot of knowledge in this area. Ira's like, I've got a lot of knowledge in this area. If we could talk, we could get somewhere. And the first one that we got from Leroy was at the beginning of this year. And he goes, I'll bite. Where did you get my name? And what is it that you think you know that can help me? With help, I can prove my claim of innocence. So all along, Leroy has claimed that he was not responsible for the death of his niece and her boyfriend, the one that he's serving a life in prison for. We say, write out. We'd love to sit down and talk to you. The key to all of this is that we have to be on his guest list. And so that's what we ask for is, can I be on your guest list at the prison so that we can come talk to you? And if that would have happened, we would have been able to go into the prison without a tape recorder. We would have been able to talk to him, but we would have had that ability to have a face-to-face conversation, or at least a telephone face-to-face conversation.
Did he explicitly say anything about Anita?
At that point, we weren't discussing Anita. At that point, we were just looking to get a connection. We basically didn't want to give a lot away, didn't want to have this conversation over email or over JPay. So we said, we're interested in a face-to-face. That's the best way to deal with this. And that's about when things went dark, right? Yeah. So we didn't get anything back. But right before the podcast and the weeks before the podcast was to air, that's when I brought up everything about Anita. We wanted to make sure that he knew exactly what we would be talking about and that he had a chance to answer back.
And in that letter, you tell him explicitly who you are, what we were doing, that we were telling Anita's story, and that we were looking for what might have happened to her and who killed her.
Yeah, and at that point, my goal is to be really honest and straightforward, but I didn't know what he knew about Anita's disappearance. I didn't know if he knew she had been found because that happened in 2020. So, my goal was to be very honest, but to let him know that we did know things. We would like to talk to you about Anita and what you know about her life and her death. We never received an email back on that.
He never responded.
Never responded.
A few weeks later, you received another message from someone else.
This one, okay, so as I said, usually it's just a ping to my email system saying JPay has messaged you. And you're like, oh, what's going on? So Leroy's must have gotten back to me. And this was about a month later. And I will tell you, this one sort of stopped me cold in my tracks. I think I messaged you guys like, what the heck? It says, hello, Kristen. I was wondering, are you going to make contact? Waiting for dialogue. Who are you? Preston. So let me get a little bit back because we haven't really talked about Preston. So Preston is Leroy's brother. Preston is also serving a life sentence for the murder of his niece. and her boyfriend. So the same crime that Leroy is in prison for. I had I think, had a conversation with the officers who had gone back as a cold case and had gone through and reinvestigated everything about the murder of the niece and the boyfriend. And he had some strong recollections about their dynamics between the two brothers.
Right. Everyone that we talked to who knew them would always bring them up as a pair.
So did not expect to get an email from Preston. Was not quite sure what he knew.
So Preston referred you to someone, to Ina.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. So, I wrote a big long note, basically very similar to the one that I wrote to Leroy, telling him who we were, where we were at, and where we were doing with the podcast, that we'd love to know about him, that we'd love to go out there and talk to him, same kind of thing. But in the note that I sent Preston, I'd let him know that Anita had passed away. And his answer was, condolences to Anita's relatives. As for your request, after sincere considerations, it's best that this be referred to the mother of my children, Miss Ina. She's waiting on the contact. Gave me times and a way to call her, and said, and Leroy hasn't contacted me on this or any other materials in several years.
And I actually had a chance to talk to Ina. And before I tell you about our conversation, I just want to back up a moment and give you a family tree. I know that the audience, you all have been so great in following us through our complicated family tree, me and Antonio. And now I'm going to just break down this family tree for a moment. So Preston is Leroy Lyons' brother. Kristen has laid that out for us pretty well in understanding that. Now, Ina is the sister of Sharice Williams. And Sharice and Leroy were longtime partners. Sharice and Leroy are the ones who had the children who died in that house fire. And Leroy was also with Sharice when he was seeing my sister Anita. Ina and Preston were also together during that time period. So it was two sisters, Ina and Sharice, with two brothers, Preston and Leroy. Now, Ina now lives in Detroit. She's a grandmother, and her sister, Sharice, died about a decade ago. The two of them met Leroy and Preston when they were really young, and she says that Leroy was a really good provider to them during that time period. And their story, I just want to say, in many ways, is similar to Anita and Val's story. Their mother died when they were younger, and the two of them were basically on their own at a very young age. Like Val and Anita, Ina and her sister Sharice. And she says that when she and Sharice met Leroy and Preston, they just felt secure with them for a time until things got bad. And as we learn more, we definitely will share it with you, the audience. Okay, let's take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to share another puzzling detail about the initial crime scene report and the witness account. We are here. Summer is upon us. And I'm thinking about not being in my kitchen all summer, except for cutting up some fruit, melons, and stuff like that. You know, maybe a little barbecue. Otherwise, I am looking to meet my wellness goals by doing maybe chef-created meals with options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto through Factor. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how busy you are, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great tasting meals. Make today the day you kickstart a new healthy routine. Head to factormeals.com/Tanya50 and use Tanya, Tonya 50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month. That's code Tanya, Tonya 50 at factormeals.com/Tanya50 to get 50% off your next box, plus 20% off your next month. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Okay, so I've been thinking a lot lately. Where does the time go? Because I'm often working on a project or taking care of what feels like a never-ending to-do list, and then suddenly I'll look up and months have passed. She Has a Name has been a labor of love for several years now, and I am so proud to get it out into the world, and it feels good to recognize that. We're halfway through the year, and when life moves this fast, it's important to take a moment to celebrate your wins and to see if you need to make any adjustments for the rest of the year. And therapy can help you take stock of your progress and set achievable goals for the next 6 months. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. And you can just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time at no additional charge. Take a moment, visit betterhelp.com/Tanya to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/TONYA.
I'm still trying to communicate with Preston, still trying to see if he'll sit down and talk with us. But his last JPay to me was actually, it was really impactful. Hello, Miss Fraser. I spoke with Ina, advised contact was made. Now that you have some views of what the dynamics are, I can tell you, Anita truly was a beautiful soul that always showed me love and goodwill. Anything I ever asked of her, it was granted. She went out of her way to contact me after my release from federal prison. We shared a very close relationship. I loved her very much. By no means did she deserve that fate. Had I known in advance, the events would have been different. Believe that she trusted me as I trusted her unconditionally. What a tragedy. They would give their last to help you. Let me know however else my assistance may be had. She expected that of Mr. P. That's what she always called me. Preston.
Wow.
I can say, like, the letter from Preston, when you first got that, we might have been all together, I feel like. And maybe we're in Philly. I don't know, maybe I'm misremembering, but I just remember being so stopped in my tracks by that, by just the way he signed it. First, the detail that gets me the most is she would expect this from Mr. P. That's what she would call me. It's so personal. And I remember we were talking about, like, we don't know what he's trying to do in sending you to Ina. And then you talk to Ina and now he says all of these things. It's so impossible to know what somebody else is thinking in a situation like this, but it felt really personal and it felt heartbreaking. And I kind of just wanted to be like, just tell us, help us. You seem to know that we need help. Give it to us.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about inconsistencies that we discovered in the reporting, specifically about that house fire on Wanda Street where Anita's body was found in November of 1987, and really what those inconsistencies might mean for the investigation. The inconsistencies we discovered in the reporting, where Anita's body was found, listeners might remember I went through some of the newspaper archives to see if there was reporting. And at first I couldn't find anything. And then Kristen went back and looked again. And after we got the crime scene report and saw the estimation of Anita's age was wrong, we found that there was indeed reporting on the house fire and Anita's body being found inside. So it's likely those who knew Anita wouldn't have seen that report and put it together. There were also, though, some other inconsistencies that you found, Kristen, in the reporting. Can you go through what you found since that last time we went through some of those archives?
The first brief that I found was in the Free Press. So it said the 17700 block of Wanda. So the 17700 block of Wanda. And it was a woman found beneath the rubble in an abandoned home, young woman, 15 to 20 years old, or believed to be. and an autopsy was supposed to be done. I got onto this little thing that every time I searched the address on Wanda that we had on the police reports, it would give me an address close. Like, you know how when you go through Google Maps and you put in an address that doesn't exist, it just sort of puts you to the next one. And so I'm like, okay, this is weird. So I send a note to the Detroit Preservation Society, and have them sort of look at it. And they had things that I hadn't even thought about. They have old maps. They have old telephone books. They were able to do some crisscrosses. And she came back and said that address doesn't exist. And I'm like, what? What do you mean the address doesn't exist? We do have a police report. We do have all of this. And I just could not find this address ever having existed. Now, you need to put into perspective that a lot of addresses in Detroit disappeared because people would buy up the properties next to them. So oftentimes, you'll have a chunk of thing owned by three properties owned by one person. And then, one person owns this, the bank owns the next one, the city of Detroit owns the next one, then somebody owns three properties. So I was like, okay, well, maybe this number just got
dissolved
enveloped.
as part of a big lot being purchased.
So we went to the office of registrar, and I wanted to sort of see this number. And she went back to like 18 something, and she's like, that address doesn't exist. We do know the event happened. We do know that body was found.
Right. But like, what does this tell us though, if this was recorded wrong when it comes to the investigation? Because I would think that due diligence would mean that you would probably look back at who owned this home prior. Just, when you find a dead body in an arson, then you're going to immediately, okay, who owned this home, right? And let me go back and look at records to see who did.
That's what got me digging, right? Is that I wanted to see how I could figure out who owned this house before. That seemed like a real logical thing. It seems like something police would have done. If police would have done that, they would have changed the number, because we were able to figure out which house it was, and they were off by a couple of numbers, the right block, but they were off by a couple of numbers. But, even in the newspaper reporting, it was a little weird as I started finding more stuff, because as I went to preservation, I went to there's a great, the Burton Library is a historical library that keeps a bunch of stuff. One of the few places that seemingly has held on to a lot of Detroit history. And while I was there, the woman found an article from the Detroit News. It had a totally different address. It had the 1700 block, but had more information in other ways. So it had an unidentified woman found on the dining room floor, vacant house, woman killed and house set on fire to hide body, and that this was the 12th arson murder for
that year,
1987. So the 12th body found in an abandoned house. So this was a lot more information, but it's the same date as that Detroit Free Press article that we had. So that was the one that said 15 to 20. And now this one's calling him an unidentified woman, where just down the street, they're calling her 15 to 20-year-old. Now, maybe they went and published it at a different time, but Tanya, you and I both have worked in the news, and we know that usually in these kind of things, you got like a blotter, a
report that comes out in every,
from that.
Right. But it also made me think about this time period of 1987. This is right before our time when we became reporters, when, just the advent of the internet allowed us to digitize things in a way to have a digital record. I was a crime and cops reporter for many, many years. And one thing that I marveled at, in the same way that I marvel at reporters who have their reporter notebooks out at scenes and is like scribbling things, is like how inaccuracies can make their way into the document in both ways. You're assessing the journalism, two different places right down the street from each other, the same date, have very different details. And yeah, they could have talked to different people within the department, and maybe that might have been the reason why. And then you also see from the official record that the actual address is wrong. And so could that have been an error with the reporting cop on the scene? We don't know, but it makes me think about the bigger picture about how many inaccuracies overall during that time period as we try to piece together so much of this history that is even no longer here, because that's part of the challenge of this story too. Yep. Sergeant Jones arrived to this case really 2016 into 2019, 2020. And she had to piece all of this together on her own. And so really she, as she says, we're starting from scratch. Yes, there are those documents, but she's not even going by those documents anymore because she understands what has been lost and what they need to just start from scratch with.
And it made me think a lot too about, because I'm a civilian coming at this with no kind of reporting experience in this way, it made me think so much about Antonio trying to go through all of this paperwork, just a person with no experience with this. And then you see an inconsistency. And what does that make you think? Maybe it makes you think maybe they got it wrong. Maybe it wasn't her. Like, just, it feels impossible as just an ordinary citizen to try to find your loved one if you have to rely on just this alone and you don't have anyone to guide you through the process.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Also, going back to the inconsistency with the house number, I also just wonder if maybe the place that it was in maybe played a larger part, like Wanda Street and Highland Park. There's a lot of abandoned houses. I wonder if the police were just like unsure what the worth would be in like looking back into the house ownership because there's such a prevalence of that.
That's a very slippery slope. I know this from my reporting. I've done stories where there have been witness accounts when police have told us there are no witness accounts. And I've gone and actually gotten those witness accounts. And so, it's part of the larger discourse that we're having about policing. And it's an interrogation because we don't want what happened to Anita to continue to happen to people. Technology has improved things. Policing has undergone its own reckoning. Although it seems pretty small, it is actually a pretty big deal.
And I do think it's important for the listener to know that Kristen is never going to let something go. I mean,
right.
And we ended up meeting one of the witnesses that gave police an account of the fire where Anita's body was later found.
Yeah, one of the first things she says is Kristen introduced herself and she's like, "You've called me, right?"
What did she tell you?
She seemed very hesitant to talk at first. And once we mentioned that we were looking into this fire that maybe she had witnessed, she started to recall. She says that that's like a very, very traumatic memory for her. One detail that stuck out was that she said she vividly remembers a blue Lakers jacket on one of the people that she witnessed. But her account sort of is a little different from what's written in the statement.
That's a very interesting detail about a blue Lakers jacket. Because when you all first told me that, I was like, those colors don't match.
That's what I said too. I was like, are we sure it's not like a Detroit Piston? Is it Pistons?
Lions?
Lions. See, I don't know football. But I was like, this seems like the colors of the Detroit team, so maybe we should check that out. But when we Googled it, there was such a thing as a blue Lakers jacket around that time period. So it very well could be possible that that was correct.
And she said that witnessing this fire was, Marie mentioned it was traumatizing. I mean, it shaped the course of her life. She did not want to be in Detroit anymore because she was so fearful of what would happen to her because of what she'd seen.
When you talked to her, there were some discrepancies in what the report said and what she says she told police.
Right. What she remembers is in the house across the street from where the fire happened. She was at the top floor in her bedroom window. She could see a fire sort of just erupt immediately. And after that, she saw a man come out of the house with a blue Lakers jacket. In the report, it says that the witness saw a man light a match and then drop it. And then that's when the fire happened. She says she couldn't have possibly witnessed a man light through her bedroom window to the other side of the street. So she's not sure where that detail came from.
Also, it's a weird detail
specific.
Because the detail in the police report, in the crime report, It's weird because it says looking out the window in the back window. Do you remember? It was like looking out of their
the back
window,
of the house.
witness
That was the very
to the back
curious
window.
thing.
And that seemed weird. Like it didn't
Yeah.
make any sense.
And very buttoned up,
I think
too.
it's pretty obvious, too, she hasn't been spoken to by the police since when it happened.
Okay, let's take a short break. And when we come back, my producers and I will go through some of your letters about how this podcast has impacted you. Imagine if one day you were accused of something terrible. You swear you didn't do it, but no one believes you because someone says they saw you do this terrible thing, and that someone is your own brother. Beyond All Repair is a new podcast series from WBUR in partnership with ZSP Media, and it tells the story of a woman named Sophia Johnson, who was accused of murdering her mother-in-law in 2002. At the time, Sophia was 6 months pregnant and gave birth to her son in jail. She hasn't seen him since. And so for the past 3 years, she's been telling WBUR's Anne-Marie Sievertson her story in hopes of getting justice for her mother-in-law, having a chance to meet her son, and finally being believed. The question is she telling the truth? Listen to Beyond All Repair wherever you get your podcasts.
The island of Newfoundland keeps its secrets close, shrouds them in mystery. But once in a while, the fog is lifted, the truth comes out.
I get a feeling there's something going on here. My whole body was shaking.
You go to bed believing that you're a certain person one night, and then all of a sudden the next day, everything that you've known is not true.
This is not the life that I should have lived.
I'm Luke Quinton from CBC. This is Come By Chance. Available now.
I want to get into now some of the things we heard from our listeners about how the podcast has allowed them to grapple with hard things in their families, the impact of traumatic events that they've buried deep inside or avoided facing. And I want to play a letter from a listener who talked about something that as a Detroiter I have grappled with and we've discussed in this podcast. And this letter comes from Christina, who grew up in Detroit in the 80s and 90s. Let's listen.
Hey, Tanya. My name is Christina, and I'm originally from Detroit. She Has a Name has touched my soul and unlocked some things for me that I've been pushing down for years. I grew up on the Far East Side in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and decided not to return after I graduated from college. So many people have asked me if I would ever move back to Detroit, and my go-to response, always delivered with a laugh, has been that I survived 18 years there and I didn't want to chance it. The laugh was to make whoever I was telling more comfortable because the statement was uncomfortably true. As a child, I felt like danger was always right around the corner. My parents were both Detroit cops who openly and frequently talked about violence. They always had on local news, which was full of terrifying stories. Add that to the things that were happening in the neighborhood, and it was just too much for me. When I would visit home from college, all I could think about was getting back to Ann Arbor so I could feel safe again. Tanya, your ability to discuss your fears as a child growing up in Detroit opened something inside of me that I feel like I've been pushing down forever. I spoke with my husband of 12 years for the first time about how scared I was growing up and how I think that fear has transformed into everyday anxiety. This podcast feels like a love letter to Detroiters and our collective pain. So thank you for your willingness to share. It means so much to people like me.
Oh, Christina's letter. I'm thinking about something you said at the start of our conversation, Kristen, when you said how this entire process has been cathartic and really healing. And because we've been talking to the living and we've been hearing about survivors, I think In this instance, Christina is also representative of that for me because it was so cathartic for me to talk about my fears growing up. And in the context of this story about my family, and part of why, like Christina, I never talked about it is because there's just an overwhelming amount of almost like guilt and betrayal for talking about it, as if acknowledging it and saying it somehow is a betrayal of the love that you have for a city. I'm thinking about the other letters that we've received from people or just comments where folks have mentioned how traumatized they were as children growing up in Detroit, but how affirming it was to hear it in a story form and hear other people who are trying to work through that. What a gift it is to be able to be in community like this, to grapple with these things.
I think it's once you can say it to yourself, that's the first thing, right? But when you can say it out loud, when you can use that aspect of storytelling to help you be able to face something, and it becomes a lot less powerful when you can actually talk about it. And even if it's just a catalyst for that conversation with someone you love, or a therapist or anything like that, it is really amazing that we've been able to be that catalyst for a lot of people.
One thing that stood out for me from Christina's comment is her saying that it feels like a love letter to Detroit. I feel like that is good. Like, it feels like we were successful in that pursuit because we were really conscious, especially when putting the story together, about just what common narratives have been portrayed about Detroit. Everyone hears about sort of the loss of the automotive industry and sort of how the city declined because of that. But it's much, and what I've learned sort of becoming acquainted with Detroit through the project is it's so much more complex than that. And I think what gets lost in that narrative is the resilience of the people that still live there. Mm-hmm. And so it just feels really great as someone involved in the making that sort of love for Detroit that I think we've all sort of come to love the city comes across in the storytelling.
I do want to say, though, it's extremely painful for older generations who have stayed to hear about their children being traumatized and leaving the city. The stories like Christina's of kids who felt like they could not stay in the city. And I can imagine it's hard because as a parent, I'm doing the best that I can for my kids. And I know my mother was doing the best she could for me and so many of our mothers in Detroit. And so it's hard to hear this stuff sometimes.
I think, though, that we, and especially you, Tanya, put an extraordinary amount of trust in the audience that has been rewarded. This letter makes me feel that it has been rewarded, that trust, that they could hold the nuance of both loving something, but also needing to get away from it. In episode 1, we quote your mother saying it was the best of times and worst of times, and introduced that Detroit is both a place that you love, that so many people love, but that it was a place that a lot of people could not stay. And so often a narrative around Detroit, what I knew of Detroit before is that it was empty in the automotive industry and these negative things, and the people that were there were sort of lost because the narrative is too high level and it's too plain. Mm-hmm. And what we were able to do in this show is complicate it a little bit, add the complexity and the nuance and the texture and the love and the fear and all of it, and present an actual city to people and not just a headline.
I still think about some of the most moving letters that we've gotten, and it's from people who are processing their own grief, and they can see themselves through Antonio. And I want to read a note just from one that really encapsulates this. This is from Alicia. She says, my mom passed in 2002 during my 10th grade year. It's definitely been a process of learning to live with grief. I heard she has a name and was deeply moved by you and your nephew. Thank you. It was short and it was sweet. And it's representative of several letters that we got from people. We all are dealing with some level of grief or will deal with grief. And it's one of the things that we have also taken on, and Antonio has been so brave to allow himself bear to see his process as he deals with the things that he learned through the making of this podcast and after finding his mother in 2020.
There's something about the way we made the show, too, that just like has opened up, made it feel safe for people to talk about what they've been through. I mean, you all know, I've told you so much, but my dad grew up in Akron, Ohio in a similar situation. And I've heard stories I've never heard from him over the course of the making of this podcast. Even just telling him about what we were learning, what people were sharing, how cathartic it was for them. I feel like, and you know, I don't know for sure, but I think that him seeing somebody else be brave in that way made him a little bit more brave. And him seeing that they were putting all this information out and sharing all these things and going deep and it wasn't being perceived as bad made him understand that he could do it too.
It's the same thing with my mom. She had like a pretty rough childhood in Colombia, and I had a conversation with her, and she was like, I just don't understand why it was so bad to not tell you these things growing up. Like, I wanted to protect you and create like a, you know, I don't want you to see me as someone that suffered growing up. I just don't think that would serve you. And I was like, well, Mom, I feel like until we've had really candid conversations about what your life was like growing up, I feel like I haven't been able to see you as a whole person and just like, you know, understand sort of like some of your reactions to like things I do. Stuff like that didn't make sense. And like, I feel like especially like my mom was pretty overprotective growing up, and I never really understood where that came from until we had like an open discussion about what she went through.
Yeah, just think about how Antonio being able to go through this process. We've talked about this many times, but it's the same thing that you're saying, Marie, is his children are now able to see him. He's able to see his mother and understand her in ways that he did not know before this process. And in turn, his children are learning to understand what he went through and how that really determines the father that they see in front of them today.
It's never too late, right? Just because you weren't in that place and space to be able to do it then, Marie, the chance that you guys can do it now, what a great gift.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so some of the most surprising letters for me came from people who actually knew Anita. So one writer, Amos from Detroit, told us that he used to watch boxing matches with Anita and knew how much she loved Sugar Ray Leonard, which was a detail we didn't get into in the podcast. But we learned that Anita didn't just like boxing, she loved boxing. And this is something that you connected with, Nicole.
Yes, I love boxing. I've been training for maybe 7 years now. And Anita, I mean, meeting her son, meeting her sister, meeting all these people that loved her so much, she feels almost more than a human. But for some reason, the detail of her boxing made it like, oh, wait, I can relate to this person. She was just a woman, and when she wasn't working, when she wasn't taking care of everybody, she wanted just to disappear into something else. And for her, it was boxing. And for me, I do find that boxing is, when I'm doing that, I can't think about anything else. I don't know where I am. It's just sort of it's the most present I feel I am at any given moment in my day, just because you have to be very on. But also it's such a beautiful sport where you, of course, yes, you want to beat somebody up. You do want to win, but also you want to do it skillfully. You know, you always, when you're boxing, everybody always talks about chess because it's very much about studying your opponent, knowing yourself, and respecting the ring and knowing how to use all three to win. And when somebody lands a good punch, it's so rewarding. And so just picturing her in the stands, you know, people told us that when she was watching boxing, she was loud. When I watch boxing, I am loud. It just made me feel that much more connected to her. And it while boxing wasn't the detail that we really brought out in the story, I think we did I will say myself, I'm really proud of the work that we did to make Anita not just seem like a godlike figure, but like a person that everyone could relate to. So many people have written in and said that they could connect with her and connect with her story. And I think that's just, the boxing detail was a reminder that, okay, I need to be looking at her, not just through the eyes of her family, who of course love and worship her, but also as a woman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I feel like that detail also just reminded me how young she was. Like, she was in her 20s. Like, this is like, I don't know. I feel like in my head a lot, I wrap her identity as like Antonio's mother and viewing her as a motherly figure, which is like a lot of what was described to us in terms of like how she acted with the people she loved. But like Nicole said, it's like that detail reminds me, she's just a woman. She is just trying to go fangirl over Sugar Ray Leonard in her free time. And it's like just like a detail that reminds you of just like, you know how frivolous you being in your 20s can be, and just like those like little.
She's just a girl,
pursuits. Exactly.
Right.
She's just a girl.
Yeah. You know, one of the other things, every letter, all the details, big and small, are so meaningful. And one thing that really moved both me and Antonio is the love on Facebook. In particular, very specifically, the hundreds of prayers. Like, they're just hundreds and hundreds of comments from people who are just have the prayer hands up, or sending prayers, sending love. And this brought something up for you, Nicole, because you noticed something every time we go to Detroit and we were on our way out.
Yeah. So the something that I feel is very specific in particular to Detroiters is that whenever we would meet with somebody and we would leave, no matter where we were in the city, no matter who we were talking to, male, female, young, old, everyone always said, be safe. That was the last thing that they would say to us. Not have fun, or, drive safe, or, and it was always be safe, everyone. And it's both a loving thing to say, because it's not thrown off like, oh, how are you? Like, it was a very intentional be safe. It's so loving, but it also, is reflective of the awareness people have of where they are and the life that they're living, and the fact that we are outsiders. It would remind me too of like the amount of trust that they would put in us, because I don't think anybody mistook me or Kristen or Marie as being from Detroit.
I want to end with a letter from a listener that deeply moved both me and Antonio. I think it sums up the beautiful ways this podcast has impacted all of us. It comes from Regina.
Dear Antonio and Tanya, I listened to episode 5, The Guy from Detroit, and was so taken by the episode, specifically the conversation that occurred around minute 16. Antonio said the following about his rationale for keeping his past experiences quiet, vaulted. I just never led with that in conversation at all with anyone, because, when people associate traumatic events with you, then that's where their mind goes to, and it makes it hard for them to focus on anything else you see. This was stunning language for me, meaning I was stunned. I have also not put all of my cards on the table with any other person in my life. Although married now for 33 years, there are aspects to my childhood I have yet to share with my spouse. There are things about my upbringing that have never been voiced. I have always had a hard time articulating why, but Antonio articulated my most truthful why. I don't want others to associate traumatic events with me in a way that they begin to see me differently, think of me differently, treat me differently. Thank you, Antonio, for the gift of sharing your truth. I also dig your particular use of language. I had to write down the phrase in order for us to have our mastermind alliances. That evoked so much for me and made me smile. Tanya, thank you for the skillful and artful way you are illuminating a path forward out of held and silenced trauma. What you're doing with season 6 is a continuation of season 5 for me. The compassion with which you continue to help educate and empower your listeners around the topic of trauma and its deeply damaging effects is so generous and loving. Your focus on trauma corrective practices is also healing. Season 6 feels like a gift through story. because of season 6, I'm able to see myself in a new light, a new lens. I'm so grateful to you and Antonio for your deep level of transparency and sharing. It has changed me. This season is a love letter also. Anita. I am grateful to know her name. Her legacy of love lives on.
Thank you for listening to She Has a Name. And I want to say that although this was a podcast about healing and family connection, we are also trying to solve Anita's murder. If you have any information on the murder and disappearance of my sister, Anita Wiley, please email me at Tonya, Tonya, at deartbt.com. That's Tonya at deartbt.com. Or contact Detroit Police and ask to speak to Sergeant Shannon Jones. We'll continue to update this podcast feed as we get information. Also, there is more She Has a Name coming your way. Antonio and I are going to delve into the mailbag and answer some of your burning questions. And we'll also explore what it truly means to be Black and missing in this country and the efforts underway to close the disparity. We'll also talk about what you should do if you ever find yourself dealing with a missing loved one. Until then, take care and be safe. She Has a Name is a TMI and APM Studios production. Our team includes executive producer Antonio Wiley, showrunner Nicole Hill, audio producer Marie Mendoza, and research producer Kristen Fraser. Our original music was composed by Andy Clausen. Sound design and final mastering by Enrico Benjamin. APM's executive producer is Erica Kraus. Senior production manager is Nick Ryan. And APM executives in charge are Joanne Griffith and Chandra Kavadi. I'm your host, creator, writer, and executive producer, Tanya Mosley. Thank you to my admin, Rochelle Roberts, and Melissa Kuipers at NPR West. And a special thanks to everyone who talked to us: Valerie Wiley-Smith, Frank Smith, Linda Wiley, Sergeant Shannon Jones, Ira Todd, Teresa Hill, Stephen Williams, Cortez Merritt, Marie Mosley, Anita Brown, Rhonda Smith, Patrick Hunter, Clarence Williams, Monique Butler, Corinne Elizabeth, Ina, and Florine. Dr. Robin L. Smith and her team, Reggie Jacques and Charlene Horn. I also want to acknowledge our friends and family who have helped us by being a listening ear and in many instances, a shoulder to cry on. Hope Wilson, Janae Desmond Harris, Candace Fortman, and Enrico, I'm looking at all of you. And to the listener, this is for us.